question but would rather not be on camera, you can also send a message to me at any point in the chat, and I can ask a question on your behalf. But right now, I want to hand over to Gay Seidman, who's going to introduce Craig. Gay is a professor of sociology at the department here at UW-Madison. So Gay, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be introducing Craig Calhoun, who I think is one of the world's leading political sociologists. As many of you know, because I've made you read his work, I think his work is incredibly useful, especially for his insights into social movements, into historical comparative work, and his discussion of critical sociology, all of which is really useful. I'm so grateful to the Haven Center for inviting him here, and I'm really glad that he could be here. Craig's work has explored social movements. It's looked particularly historically at social movements, construction of collective identities and cultures, and his argument that every social movement has to begin by defining a collective identity as well as a collective grievance, I think really changed the way American sociologists think about social movement and mobilization. And it's true from the Temperance Union in the early 19th century to the Tiananmen Square movement in China. His work has repeatedly focused on that construction of an identity as a way to think about what shapes grievances. But his later work has explored much broader social shifts, from nationalism and cosmopolitanism to discussions about how the transnational world reshapes our understanding of nationalism. And actually, I don't want to take a long time to talk about his career because I really want to get to his talk, but I feel like I need to give you a snapshot. He's served on the faculty at UNC, NYU, Columbia, LSE, and Arizona as chair of the Social Science Research Council for, is it really 13 years, Craig? That's ridiculous. But he reshaped the way funding for social science research in the United States works in really important ways and really creative ways. And those of us who do that kind of work are really grateful for all that he did. After that, he was 4 years as the director of the London School of Economics. And then he became the founding president of the interdisciplinary, I can't pronounce that institute, I'm sorry, Craig, you're gonna have to do it, which is an independent think tank, which he was the first president, it was just created, aimed at shaping political and social institutions in the face of the great transformations of the 21st century. And I actually can't think of a better person to do that, because Craig thinks more broadly than any other social scientist I know. Today, he is the university professor of social sciences at Arizona State University at the Global Institute of Sustainability in the College of Global Futures, which is like the best title that anybody could ever come up with. So I am so happy that you're speaking, and with your wonderfully alliterative title, Degenerations of Democracy, I am so looking forward to this talk. Thank you.
All right, thank you. With luck, I am no longer muted. I hope that's the case. And I feel like I should apologize for all the alliteration, but I won't. Let me just go straight into the talk. I've packed too much into it, so I don't want to take extra time in preamble. The theme here is Degenerations of Democracy, by which my collaborators and I mean internal problems that arise in democracy as distinct from external attacks or just the depredations of terrible leaders. We suggest that there are at least 3 important dimensions on which degeneration has been an issue for the last 50 years in the US: citizen empowerment, inclusive identity, and solidarity. And I'm going to talk mainly about the solidarity piece of this puzzle, and in the general frame of thinking of democracy as defined by liberty, equality, and solidarity, but suggesting that for the 50 years of the neoliberal era, we have had a kind of hypertrophy of liberty and a neglect of equality and solidarity. And even as we have begun to pay more and more attention to the problems of increased equality, we have been slower to attend to the problems of solidarity, or if you will, the social. The book that is nearly out, I hope, the book forthcoming, Degenerations of Democracy, is a collaboration with Charles Taylor and Dilip Gaunkar. It has a lot of different threads in it, but I want to talk today about a story of eroding social foundations, which I think of as the Polanyi story in all of this. There's been a great Polanyi revival in social science. When Polanyi published his famous book, The Great Transformation, it didn't catch on immediately and become a bestseller. It sort of, like most academic books, sold modestly to specialists. And Polanyi felt that he was cursed by being too much an economist for sociologists and too much a sociologist for economists. And the book only gradually attracted a following. And it, in fact, became a sort of classic without ever having become really popular and widespread and included in the curricula of all sorts of universities. Now, I think Johanna Brockman, in a recent introduction to her translation of some of Polanyi's early work, probably exaggerates when she says Polanyi is second in popularity only to Foucault. But she doesn't exaggerate hugely. He's become much more popular recently. He's moved onto center stage, largely because The Great Transformation speaks so well to the neoliberal era in ways almost uncanny, though I think there are a couple of issues with how it speaks to the neoliberal era that I'm going to talk about. And there are a lot of people who have been leading the resurgence of Polanyi, none more than probably Peggy Summers and Fred Block, and applying this to his account of market society. Now, I want to suggest Polanyi is great, but he isn't everything. And I sort of a beginning here is this is not mainly a talk engaged in exegesis of Polanyi, and it's not certainly not hagiography of Polanyi. I think that we need to have multiple theoretical heroes. Polanyi is one of mine, but I've got lots. And this talk isn't therefore arguing that one should become a Polanyian rather than a Marxist, a Weberian, a something else. It's suggesting there's a particular thread to understanding our current predicament that is brought out well by returning to some of Polanyi's themes. Now, I mentioned Block and Summers, and at the heart of Polanyi's account is an account of markets and society. But let me point out that one of the issues of critique here is whether markets is an adequate substitute for capitalism and what we'll do about it. Fred Block, for example, in a recent book, has written about capitalism, subtitling it The Future of an Illusion, because he, and to some extent Peggy, I think, regard capitalism as a reification. And they think much discussion of capitalism involves a sort of social naturalism, to use Summers' category. That is, it treats it as a real force that is constantly causing things to happen. I think that critique could be overstated. I think it's a problem when it happens. I think we need the notion of capitalism, but I think it takes up something different. And I think the importance of markets as markets and of a market economy in which markets dominate over the rest of society is a needed focus of analysis, and it does speak to our recent period. Polanyi, though, writes of the Great Transformation, which he thinks takes the form of a double movement. It's one big historical transformation in his book, the rise of market society as a disruption and immiseration of people in England. He has a lovely opening half to the argument entitled Satanic Mill, which I think in the singular makes the point that he's referring both to factories, the famous satanic mills of the Blake poem, and the economist James Mill, father of John Stuart, and classical political economy generally. And running through Polanyi's story is the notion that ideas really matter, and turning ideas into ideology is very influential, but never free-floating from actual social changes that are going on. So there really is a rise of market society, as well as the rise, or rather market economy, as well as a rise of a conception of the dominance of markets, which substitutes for the rest of society. The second big section of Polanyi's book is entitled Self-Protection of Society, and it records a kind of response, a reaction to the first movement of destruction associated with market society, but also lots of innovation. Polanyi is misread if he is seen as only talking about some sort of restorationist movement or repair work in society. He's clearly talking about producing something new, socialism or social democracy, depending on what one wants to call it. Now, we might ask whether double movements are an inherent pattern of modern society. As I see it, we have double movements over and over again. We have a modern era constituted by some specific contradictions. And I don't place much weight on the term modern or want to engage in postmodern. I'm just meaning roughly the last few hundred years, but they've been shaped by contradictions that play out in various ways, including in the double movements that Polanyi describes. So I would prefer to think of contradictions as the core term in double movement as a reflection, which is why we get more than one, and we get them at different scales. Now, market economies are in many ways familiar, so I'm about to go over terrain that I think everybody here will have gone over to some extent, some in much more detail than others, but trying to pull out a few features and combining a bit of Polanyi with where I want to go in the rest of the talk. First off, Polanyi is attentive to the extent to which classical political economy grounds itself in claims to universal human nature, famously in Adam Smith's line, in the propensity to barter, truck, and exchange one thing for another, which Smith says is universal core to what a human being is. This becomes a significant feature of economic thought and of related thought, like Malthus's work. It incorporates an implicit individualism because this is understood as the attribute of human beings in their discrete separateness. And it encourages just so stories like Robinson Crusoe, in which these discrete human beings enter into patterns of exchange. Well, Friday, if I gave you a coconut, right, what would happen? Now, we can laugh, but there are literal Robinson Crusoe versions of this throughout the 19th century. And there are continuations of this on into the contemporary era. And much of the reasoning of economic models starts from notions of a rational actor. They may not make claims that this is the whole of what human beings are, but this is the whole of what's significant for them as economic figures in this. Now, Polanyi identifies this tendency to reason from human nature as both ideology and error, and he opposes it particularly to history, to reasoning from history, which means both particular histories, there will be multiples of them, and thus human beings are not all the same as each other, and cultures and societies are not all the same as each other, and paths of change, which could have been otherwise, in which human choices and other factors make differences in outcomes. So that we need the depth of history and also the comparative reach of history as he sees it to recognize that what it is to be human is not contained within these just so stories, and to press us to look more deeply. Human beings, says Polanyi, are social, and a feature of Polanyi's account that is not always brought out is that he's really trying to reason about what it is to be human, that a central part of his account is an account of what it is to be human that then underpins the account of the Great Transformation. Markets are ubiquitous through history, he says. They become dominant at a particular time. So at one level, he can agree with Adam Smith, but only if it's a triviality. Yes, people exchange everywhere. This is common, but they exchange in different ways. And Polanyi will go on in his work as more or less an economic anthropologist to write about markets in different kinds of societies, markets that have reciprocity, markets that don't, and so forth. And indeed, in the early pages of this book about the Industrial Revolution, that's foreshadowed with significant accounts of markets elsewhere and anthropological work to try to make the point that this is not simply a universal derivative of human nature. So in a trivial sense, yes, people exchange. But in a more significant sense, is exchange the dominant organization of society? Is market exchange in particular the dominant organization of society? No, that's only characteristic of the modern era. Market dominance, moreover, is produced by exertions of power. It's not a natural phenomenon, as the universalist accounts say. It's something made, and it's made in part by state action. So what Polanyi is going to detail in history has the theoretical significance of trying to bring out the extent to which markets are made, a theme for economic sociologists recently, but rather more than most of them, Polanyi is determined to keep power at center stage. Markets aren't just made by dispersed economic actors or by something called social action, they're made by power. Individual power mobilized through wealth, but also state action. In this, the pursuit of the self-regulating market is a kind of economic utopia. It's often presented as though it is simply the characteristic of markets. They are self-regulating. But from Adam Smith forward is clearly an economic utopia, but one with great practical effect. And a significant part of Polanyi's story, less significant for me today, is an issue of change in poor laws, in welfare systems. Now, it is one of the things that gets recapitulated in a way in the neoliberal era. The 18th and 19th century version of this is that capitalism and its coming, market society, cause a variety of disruptions, which cause people to suffer unemployment, poverty, pauperism conditions. And there is a move to try to care for those people by providing them with relief. This produces the old poor law, but Polanyi is particularly concerned with a change in the poor law, not unlike the change in the American welfare system introduced in the era of Bill Clinton, in which a dominant theme is we have to make sure the welfare system doesn't keep people from being willing to be workers on the terms offered by capitalists. And this is at the heart of what Polanyi wants to argue about. I'll come back to it. As I said, in the background to all of this is a set of questions around what it is to be human, in which Polanyi is concerned about classical economics, but particularly about utilitarian variants of it that reduce people to self-interested action. He's less concerned with, but often speaks tangentially about liberalism more generally and the reduction of people to the reduction of human goals to that of freedom. And he draws a great deal on some now almost forgotten sources. The work of Tawney, for example, of the Christian socialist tradition, and ideas about moral economy. This would become the tradition, if it's familiar to us, familiar through E.P. Thompson most of the time, and E.P. Thompson's channeling of this earlier work on moral economy and the production of solidarity that's been going on for a time. He's also, although I seem to have lost a line here, indebted to utopian socialism. And one way of thinking about Polanyi's project is he wants to recover some of what Marx dismissed as the mere utopian socialists, particularly the work of Robert Owen, but more generally, the work of socialists who had a very strong emphasis on cooperation and solidarity in communities as central to what they wanted to pursue. Now, the story picks up as a story of dispossession and disruption, looking at the enclosure movement, the transformation of agriculture, which takes place over a long period of time and which Polanyi doesn't go into detail, but I want to just pull a few things out of the account, not particularly with regard to Polanyi's account of them, but with regard to their importance. There's a movement of urbanization, which involves a transformation of agriculture. It's been studied by historical sociologists and social historians now for a couple of generations. as a movement of dispossession in which the agricultural population is deprived of its ability to use lands collectively in more or less traditional ways. I'm not going to go through a lot of this, but you can think about it in relation to corn farming, which will figure prominently, and other grain farming, corn in the British sense, which it means grains more widely. But it's also applicable to forests, in which people live in forests and use them in lots of ways. And if you begin to think of forests as just natural resources, you forget that there are all of these people living in the forest, the great theme of James C. Scott, for example. Now, the three pictures here are intended to just evoke some moments in this, in which there is a relatively communal agriculture with relatively few divisions among lands and sharing and working out of relationships of reciprocity among farmers. The lower left-hand corner, what much of the English countryside looks like today, with various kinds of hedges, fences, and other barriers between segregated plots of land. That's what's produced by enclosure, and that's what it means. Now, there's another part of the story that involves bringing sheep in to replace people in Scotland. This is why I'm an American now, because my ancestors got displaced in the enclosure movement in the 18th century, right? But this is a long movement that has great significance for producing migration, as the lower right picture would suggest, including rural to urban migration, but also international migration. Now, I want to pull out two things. Polanyi discusses this under the label habitation, the idea that human beings inhabit specific places with each other, and what they lose in this dispossession is their capacity to inhabit these specific places with these specific other people. They lose their homes, in other words, but in very strong senses of what home might mean. And secondly, that this is a disruption. And one of the things Polanyi puts on the table is that disruption matters net of equality, net of immiseration, net of poverty, that the actual fact of the disruption matters becomes a key part of the story. Polanyi introduces the category of fictitious commodities, things that are bought and sold, but that are not produced for exchange, at least not yet in one case. So land is a primary example, and the enclosure story is really intended to anchor in your mind what happens when market society takes over land and it all becomes transferable commodities to be exploited as efficiently as possible. And it continues into a story of natural resources today and the way in which we face the world of climate change and so forth. Labor, same issue. Instead of markets in products, we have markets in people. We have slavery, the most important example perhaps, but we also have wage slavery, as Marx termed it. That is factory work in which people are paid for parts of their potential of lifelong labor. Their capacity to work is bought and sold, right? Not just is this hourly payment, but this is hourly payment that is defined in a strong Marxist sense, and Polanyi is influenced by Marx, as a part of overall labor power, that which might be the capacity of a life. The contrast here is to artisanal production, as it was for Marx in the early work, that is to craft work, making products in which we are not as alienated because we are in direct touch with nature, with other people. We have command over the whole product of our labor and so forth. This is being destroyed by a marketization that will produce the sale of labor as such and implicitly the laborer. And finally, money is a fictitious commodity, says Polanyi, which among other things accounts for why the book starts off talking about the gold standard, not the usual place to start off in a story of the Industrial Revolution, but critical to what he thinks the Great Transformation produced, a society that was governed by finance and concerns like the gold standard, which stood in the way of international cooperation in the 1930s and helped to pave the way to World War II for all of this. Now, this story of disruption and dispossession is important, partly, I think, because we don't internalize the account of disruption enough into our accounts of social change in class terms. This is an account of the Industrial Revolution. My upper right-hand corner picture here is a rather romanticized, idealized image of pre-industrial craft work. And one thing to bear in mind is that we don't have to imagine that craft workers were always thriving, were always well paid, and were always in these clean and lovely home settings to recognize that there was a difference. Craft workers fought against becoming factory workers. For the most part, factory workers were drawn from former agricultural laborers and from new generations. The idea that there was a division of labor in which ex-craft workers became the bulk of factory workers is mistaken, right? This takes place over a longer period of time. Now, the framework knitters, that's what's being shown in the upper right-hand corner, were a particular version of this, and I just pause on them to say they've been back in parlance because people have talked a lot about Luddites lately in the face of new technologies that transform work and threaten to put people out of work. And the word Luddite becomes almost a shorthand for saying opposition to technology. But it's worth noting that that frame in the upper right corner is a machine. The Luddites were people who used the latest technology of the 1780s until it was obsolete in the 1810s. They were not anti-technology. Their whole livelihoods as framework knitters were made possible by technology, but by one technology that could become obsolete faced with others. They were the Uber or Lyft drivers of their day. People who filled a bottleneck, but with very little security for the future and problematic situations, and in particular, a tremendous capacity for self-exploitation, because they could, as they faced more and more competition from factories, keep working, but at lower and lower rates, something familiar to Uber and Lyft drivers today. Now, a difference is framework knitters lived overwhelmingly in villages with other framework knitters. They lived in small local communities. So far as I know, there are not many communities of Lyft drivers or Uber drivers in spatial concentration. And that's significant to the kind of experience and the kind of revolt of Luddites. But before I leave this slide, let me link to the bottom. This is told, and Polanyi tells it mostly, as a story of craft work to factory work and the various ills of the satanic mills pictured below right. But it's also a story of empire, which Polanyi says rather briefly, but which is significant. That is, it's not just a domestic story of transformation, it's a global division of labor backed up by imperial power, reinforcing Polanyi's story that, his theoretical account in the story, that market making is very often a matter of power and is produced. So the transformations, textiles, and other industries that are produced by long distance trade are significant. I'll say more about it. Now, utilitarianism here, this particular variant of classical economics, but really lots of classical economics, works among other things to displace concern with social solidarity. It does this in ideology, while people with various self-interested reasons are doing this in practice. So industrial capitalism disrupted pre-existing solidarities and ways of life, like those communities of framework knitters. I might mention that the framework knitters were not one of the old crafts that had been around for hundreds of years with guilds and great old traditions. It was a relatively recent and a brief phenomenon in history, but it produced strong communities. And so this is not just about ancient tradition versus modern innovative capitalist society. It's about what happens when people build communities and then lose them. Now, that's not something Polanyi entirely brings out, but I want to get to that in my talk. But in various ways, this economic thinking devalued solidarity. It had no particular value in the economic model, the social relations, what's been recently called social capital to try to give it an economic model. By the way, I sort of object to much of the social capital literature because it's an attempt to give an economic meaning to these social relations rather than to directly value them as social relations. Devalues reciprocity and devalues redistribution. One of the things Polanyi notes about non-modern economies is that they are sharply redistributive. For example, implicitly, after a death, there is a radical redistribution of anything that had been accumulated during the lifetime of individuals. Now, not all pre-modern societies are the same, but this is a difference, among other things, from a modern corporation. So not only do billionaires tend to continue to hoard their wealth and give it to children and so forth, but corporations don't die in the same sense, and wealth isn't redistributed. So we've got an economy that works a bit differently here. This is justified, even praised by people who are saying in the long run we get richer. So at the time, people wrote of the Luddites, of those framework knitters, they are blocking progress, just as people write about critics of technological change today. And the long progress is to bring improvement in the long run. And so it's frequently pointed out, not just at the time, but through history, that the Luddites were acting against progress because wages did go up over the long run. John Maynard Keynes, famously in a different context, but with the same logic, said, in the long run, we shall all be dead. Right? Economics sets itself too easy a task if it just tries to explain that during a storm that in the future, the waves will be calmer and the ocean will be flat again, right? It took 100 years for wage rates to return to what they were for the framework knitters before the depredations they suffered in the early 19th century. The economic historian Robert Allen has called this Engels' pause because Frederick Engels wrote about it, suggesting this was the occasion for revolution, this lag. Engels and Marx agreed capitalism would make things better in the long run, but there would be this disruptive tendency in the meantime. I've already mentioned the poor laws, but the importance of the new poor law is that driven by ideologies as well as self-interests, poor law was changed to punish the poor, essentially to say you no longer deserve to be able to have your own life, you must enter a poorhouse. Husbands and wives must be separated, parents from children, in the interests of making this, in the phrase of the day, the least eligible option. That is, you should want to do anything and work on any terms for which somebody offers you a job before you would accept welfare. Right? This, Polanyi thinks rightly, was inhuman. There are debates about whether Polanyi's particular story of Spinnenlund, which has obsessed Peggy Summers for her whole career, has been right. And I think Peggy is correct in saying Polanyi didn't get the whole story right, but the basic point is sound in it. And that's the point which is at issue today, not just in the poor laws, not just in the Clinton era welfare reforms, but when there is Republican opposition to a stimulus bill on the grounds that it will lead people not to want to work. They will be somehow dependent on welfare. They would rather get unemployment insurance. So the Republican majority in the Senate has resisted extensions of unemployment insurance, giving the exact same logic that Polanyi described for these mid-19th century figures. Now, all of this produces the double movement for Polanyi, but we need to remind ourselves that the double movement isn't just some automatic process of things getting better. Marx and Engels expected this to bring revolution. Engels' pause, right? But it didn't. What it brought was first mobilization grounding in existing communities. And I've written a whole book about this a very long time ago. That is, rather than the movement of the working class, the movement of what I called then reactionary radicals, of people in local communities trying to resist becoming the modern working class. Eventually, the modern working class emerges with trade unions and class politics, and what Gay kindly described as my perennial obsession with how it is that people come to have an identity. For example, how did workers come to think of themselves as workers rather than as goldsmiths and tailors and wheelwrights and in all the other particular occupations, what knit them together? That was an achievement of an increasingly organized capitalism. Right? There were the workers resisting capitalism and market society and the workers trying to find a better place within it. Now, I want to fast forward a little bit. I'm going to do this in 2 stages, right? Revolution does not happen, right? What happens is that capitalist society keeps developing. Market economy stays dominant. Mechanization and automation continue after what the Luddites experience, on to what Charlie Chaplin experienced, and on to contemporary artificial intelligence. Businesses grew larger. Urbanization was dramatic. And with urbanization came a variety of projects of social improvement: sanitation, police, clean water, electricity, streetlights. Think of solving the cholera pandemic, as well as others. Some of them driven by people like the Fabian socialists and others who had projects of improving the life of the poor, but especially the middle class in cities. In other words, capitalist society proved much more resilient than had been anticipated by Marx and Engels. The bourgeoisie sort of consolidated in the Gilded Age, late 19th century, and began to lead a process of social reconstruction. I'm not going to try to tell all the stories of this, but it's important to get in mind 2 things. One, revolution didn't happen, and it didn't happen partly because capitalism had these capacities. And 2, that the working class adapts to and develops within capitalism, distinct from the sort of fatal situation of the Luddites before. Working class formation came largely in and after the 1880s, disrupted by the 2 world wars. It involved trade unions, it involved workers' parties, involved a variety of social institutions. I'm not going to go through all of this. What I want to stress, though, is that the workers' parties and the trade unions were also social clubs and life insurance societies. That is, that it's not an accident that trade unions in Germany opened beer halls. It's crucial that trade unions in Britain have union halls. And part of what workers in this recent era of declining unionization and loss of jobs have lost is those union halls and those beer gardens, those places of sociability and centrality to local communities. So the labor movement was never just an economic movement. It was in part a movement to reconstruct place and community, but on new scales in new places among new people. So steel towns around Pittsburgh, right, are not tiny villages like what the Luddites live in, but they are places in which the working class constructs ways of life which can be partially run by the working class. Not entirely, the mills are powerful, the owners are powerful, but there is something developed other than just immiseration to this. Polanyi famously criticized the disembedded notion of the person as self-interested actor in modern economics. Indeed, already in 1922, well before the Great Transformation, while he was still in Vienna, Polanyi was writing against this emergence of the Austrian School of Economics, which would grow into neoliberalism. Somewhat ironically, Friedrich Hayek moves to London too. They're there at the same time, and they publish their 2 great books the same year. The Road to Serfdom and The Great Transformation are published simultaneously. Hayek's to immediate influence and fame, and it becomes the founding critical work in the emergence of neoliberalism. But along with this ideological side of modern economics, there is an actual disembedding. The story Polanyi is telling is one of an actual disembedding that enabled the production of market economies. Remember the enclosure movement. People had to be broken apart from the land and from each other in order to become workers in those factories that produced the market goods that were bought by market consumers. Now, this was not a one-way process, right? Polanyi pays less attention to re-embedding. He's basically making one big proposal for the creation of what we now know as the modern welfare state and social democracy. So there is a re-embedding moment to it. But I would suggest that all along, there is a process of embedding going on and re-embedding after the disembeddings, that this is a cyclical process. Some of the time it's happening in particular places, industries, not on national scales. So there's a disruption to the mines in Minnesota, and the Finns who have been the miners find other occupations and put their lives back together in a way. So there's a process of disembedding and re-embedding. But also this is the big project of socialism and social democracy, which in a way do best in the moments when the disembedding is very widespread, moments of crisis. It's also, however, a process of capitalism, because capitalism has its own paths of re-embedding. It is not simply the disembedded ideology described by neoliberals. It is also the building of corporations in which workers are colleagues, in which people are likely to marry co-workers for the same reason that graduate students marry each other. That's who they know. In which there is not any sort of egalitarian community, but there is some level of social integration. So capitalism keeps producing new embeddedness and at elite levels. One of the features of people thinking that they are global cosmopolitans is that they think that they leave behind the local cultures and move into the realm of the universal. But what many business elites leave behind is a set of jobs that are important at a national level, and they join a transnational culture. Boards of directors are re-embeddings of people from employee to top levels. And nation states, this is not just an economic process. The development of nation states and national identities, whether for good or ill, is a process of re-embedding. And indeed, Polanyi himself in his account makes the point that part of what's changing in the Industrial Revolution is that the nation is being developed and workers are being encouraged to think of themselves at a national level. This will turn out eventually to be part of the emergence of the working class. When I said there's an identity politics to the working class, it's partly thinking of itself in national terms as distinct from very local terms and very different crafts and trades. But in a host of ways, nation states do re-embedding. Just to give me a chance to have some pictures and not just words, let's take railroads as an example of this. This is part of the enormous infrastructural development carried out in the era of the nation state and capitalism. So in an era in which Marx had predicted simply revolution and immiseration for the most part, we have a huge expansion of infrastructure and a huge expansive social integration going with it. So there's other infrastructures. There are water systems and sanitation systems and so forth. Just take railroads as they develop. They're a story of national integration. We have the time zones we have from the era of the railroads and the attempt to organize timekeeping for the railways. We did not have any nationally standardized way of doing that before. We have the banking system. We have the train at the top, and the top picture is an American Express train. The company that now operates the credit cards and the global finance work, American Express, originates as a company with rolling stock, not a company with rails, on the infrastructure of others to move. It's been doing the early stages of banking and private postal service, if way, it's both the FedEx and the Citibank of its day, across the country. Markets are developing. The modern supermarket is a byproduct, right? Some of you may remember when there were supermarkets called A&P. The A&P supermarket grew because of the Atlantic and Pacific Railway, which in the lower picture, we see the point where the golden spike was driven, marking the matching from east to west of the railway. Now, there's a whole lot of stories to go into here, which I won't. I resist. I'd hope I resist. One of them is that there had to be a standardized decision taken about how far apart the rails should be, which was in danger in this early project, remains an issue. You know, Indian railways run on a different gauge of track. This is one of the many, many places in modern history where capitalism is made possible and national integration is made possible by standard setting, by agreeing what kind of current should we have. Oh, it should be 110, not 220. Well, you know, what should the plugs look like? There are a whole roster. The internet is a creature of standard setting. With the ICANN assigning addresses so that there can be all these addresses that say .ca if you're Canadian, right? .uk if you're British, and nothing if you're American, because we are the dominant power, but .com and .gov and so forth. So the internet required a bunch of state-led legal agreements not just a new technology. And thus it is for almost all of the development of capitalism. We have a continuation of this story of state power and state agreements. I mentioned the supermarkets, not just because there was literally the A and P, but because they are devices for bringing goods from a long distance to sell many of them, like department stores, in one place. And there were other things that came along with them. James Benninger has a wonderful book that details, for example, the invention of, if you will, the aisle. The whole idea that the customer should go in the shop, take their own goods off the shelf, but be led through a maze that would expose them to lots of other things they might buy, is an intervention of the supermarket era. And there are all sorts of other things that go with this, including the production of increasingly national prices for goods. So they'll cost roughly the same thing in different places. The modern corporation and the modern financial trust are both born in the corporate era. They're foreshadowed. Corporations have an older history. Finance goes back to the South Sea bubble and things, but it's basically in financing railway construction and in running the railroads that we develop modern business management corporations in which the managers are separate from the owners, in which ownership is increasingly joint stock company, and the modern bond market as it finances all of this. And this produces the problem of trust that give rise to antitrust law and the breaking up of trusts. Now, it's not only railroads, but it's centrally railroads in this era. And of course, there are issues of immigration, the Chinese labor that was central to bringing the Western part of the trades. There are interests of labor and labor demands, and railroads will remain central as we can think of the Pullman car mobilizations, the Pullman Porter mobilizations in the railroad for a very long time. So there are a significant example of this path. There are also challenges to all of this. Right? There's huge inequality. This is the era of bourgeois consolidation. This is the Gilded Age, as Mark Twain put it, and yet there's sharp inequality. When we say that we have recently surpassed previous highs of inequality, this is one of the previous highs we've recently surpassed, right? This is the era of child labor and the campaigns to get rid of child labor. It's the era of precarious work and the campaigns for employment security. It's the era of extraordinarily long abusive working hours and the struggle to limit working hours. In other words, we've got the sort of double movement processes going on at the same time here in a struggle over this. There are a great deal of violence against unions. I must think precarity is especially important to have mentioned it twice. It's an era of crises and crashes as well. So the Gilded Age also included the 1893 stock market crisis. We get these at the same time as we do on into the present day. An era when the gold standard became an issue, and tight money. The gold standard was tied to the great populist movement, a great populist movement that had its racist side, but is easier to see as progressive than some recent populist movement in the United States, but not totally different. William Jennings Bryan proclaiming that he will not allow the American worker to be crucified on a cross of gold, is complaining that farmers are being immiserated and are losing their farms by financial industry machinations, which include the proposition that the gold standard must be maintained, that the value of the currency must be maintained, that there, and that's something that works very well for people who own debt and not very well for the people who are the debtors, who have to repay, for whom reflation would be more favorable. Story I have to cut short, and all the issues of immigration stuff that go with it. But the main point here is just, at the high point, you also have the challenges. We have waves of globalization going on. What are we doing with this Victorian architecture in Melbourne, Australia, right? What's going on with the mines in South America, which are precisely displacing the mine workers in North America, leading to songs like Joe Hill, with its reference to the mines down in Bolivia. And this is happening within empires, again, that is within structures of power and all of that. So there's a whole story, right, of the expansion beyond the nation state that develops the modern world system. And I have to put that in partly because Emanuel Wallerstein studied with Karl Polanyi. At the same time, we have a growth of consumer society, which I've already alluded to with the A&P and so forth. But mass consumerism becomes a basic feature of modern societies because people are actually making lives in modern societies. They are not just being immiserated. There is inequality and there are people who are just immiserated, but there are also is a growth of the middle class, there's social mobility. There's lots of demand for factory products, and indeed advertising is brought in to try to increase the demand, new kinds of stores that will support new, albeit unequal ways of life, but people who are finding ways to make lives. Even in shopping malls, people are doing things like getting their exercise by walking around. They're seeing other people. If they're 14 years old, they're hanging out. There are a variety of things going on pre-COVID, right? But note the three particular examples. Marks and Spencer, which grows into one of the biggest department store chains in Britain, starts out, as its sign says here, the Edgewater store, as the originators of penny bazaars. They were the dollar store of their day, and in American terms. That is, they had cheap goods for working class people, and eventually, as working class people got more money and better off, they had a more and more elaborate hookup and became more or less the Macy's. Harrods is a high-end version of this, its own international story I won't go into, and the sort of shopping mall structure, all right, to give you a sense of a long arc of mass consumerism as people make lives and all of this. The post-war boom is a particular consolidation of this. And a fault to the current talk is that I'm not spending much time on the two wars and the Depression in between. But I think the basic story is continued economic expansion interrupted by two wars and the Depression, partly because of a hegemonic transformation in the world system and the struggle over that, right? But what we get in the post-war boom is what Polanyi was asking for. Polanyi tells his whole great transformation story to lead up to the potential for a reassertion of society alongside capitalism. One of the main differences from Marx is that he says there's a compromise possible. There doesn't have to be a revolution, and we can build a new society in which there will be essentially what welfare states provide: social mobility, housing, a restoration of habitation. It may come in the form of suburbs that intellectuals dislike, but it nonetheless comes. Rebuilding and building communities is important. The University of Wisconsin figures here because of the tremendous expansion of state universities during this period. So a 30-year period that saw most of the expansion that's taken place. University of Wisconsin dates way back into the 19th century, but it enormously expands in the post-war era, driven by the GI Bill and a variety of other things. And this is part of producing a common experience for large numbers of people in society. The war itself was an example of that, something that has been largely lost in a more recent era. In this era, organized capitalism is emerging. That is, a combination of private ownership with state regulation and labor power to meet, but also to create expanded consumer demand. The kitchen at the top is the kitchen that President Kennedy showed to Premier Khrushchev when he said, "This is how we will defeat you," by building these better pink kitchens, obviously. All of this took a production of demand with broader incomes. It also took the investments in new technologies, and it took relative stability inside rich countries. Now, this doesn't apply everywhere. This is an era when the rich countries are doing all sorts of terrible things outside their borders, but they are producing this relative security, relative stability, social bargain, organized capitalism inside, right? The French call this period les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. Because there was such an expansion. It wasn't just an economic boom, as the phrase post-war boom says, so an educational boom, the healthcare system, media are changing, right? It's a tremendous flourishing society. But I want to say there are three catches to this era, which I've conveniently given the name of famous social theorists. Right? First catch is rationalization. If you want to be part of this organized capitalist story and benefit from it, you have to submit to its rationalization. The rise of bureaucracy, the rise of corporations, the rise of large-scale factories, and a whole structure of rules and compliance that people can experience as deadening. Second, there's the Bourdieu story. The story of false promises, the story of getting university degrees and then finding out that you need higher degrees. The story of expanding credentialism in Randall Collins, Bourdieu inflected sense. The story of Michael Young's idea of the meritocracy, which is originally published in 1958. Those of you who don't know, Michael Young was in fact a sociologist as well as a major figure in the British Labour Party, the founder of the Open University, and a variety of other institutions in Britain, the author of the manifesto that brought labor to power, right? And the author of a book, Rise of the Meritocracy, that raises the question, right? Are we sowing the seeds of our next crisis by creating an elite that is not the traditional aristocratic elite, but that thinks it's been brought to power on the basis of its good exam results and intrinsic merits, and therefore will both feel complacent itself and look down on workers in new ways, but also what does that do to the consciousness of workers if there is this continuous pulling out of potential meritocratic successes? Finally, this is a third catch is the Foucault catch, the disciplinary structures. It turns out that the welfare state is full of disciplinary structures. Not only Foucault has analyzed this, but say David Garland's account of the modern state as a punitive and welfare state. So discipline and punishment becomes a characteristic way of creating the states. All of these and some old issues that haven't gone away mean that that beautiful era of pink kitchens and pink Cadillacs has its downside and its discontents, despite the affluence. Now, crisis follows, and I'm conscious I'm about to run out of time, so crisis is about to hit on me here. But crisis follows in the late 60s and 1970s, and I would suggest it's really two overlapping crises. There is a crisis of the economy, and there's a crisis of solidarity and faith in the system that results in a discontent. I'll go on to chart that. First, the economy, right? The welfare state's expensive. Wage bargains are expensive. So as this organized capitalism continues, it puts pressure on profits. There are also more and more demands. This is an ever accelerating demand, right? You need a snowmobile. I don't know if anyone in Madison still remembers Red Shadow, the great Marxist rock bands, with its question of, can the working class snowmobile their way to heaven? The working class demands are considerable. Workers are well paid. Then they're met by international demands from developing countries for bigger shares of capitalist produce at the same time. See the note on Chile at the bottom. And you get a set of postponements of institutional reforms, right? There's not an immediate attack, if you will, on the working class. There's an economy measure of postponing needed institutional reforms. Also, the Vietnam War is expensive and in its last 5 years financed almost entirely by debt. President Nixon thinks he can't get a spending bill through Congress because the war is too unpopular, so it has to be bond issues. And this is one of the many beginnings of modern financialization. Same thing in Europe. European colonies are expensive. They're becoming problematic. Instead of bringing in money, there's an outflow, right? Financialization is a major part of the story and with its roots in this crisis. It's a Polanyian crisis, a disruption in the system, and only ambiguously a Marxist crisis of oversupply in the traditional sense, right? Nixon abolishes the gold standard in 1971, partly because of that debt issue that I just mentioned. The Yom Kippur War encourages the sleepy OPEC to transform itself into a organization marrying finance to and the fictitious commodity of money to oil, extending the fictitious commodity of land. The price of oil goes from $3 a barrel to $50 a barrel almost overnight, and then ultimately peaks at 100 before it falls back. We have the long-term petroleum dependency at great cost. The first major, well, many of the first major sovereign wealth funds in the world are created out of this revenue from OPEC, and including the largest in Abu Dhabi, including that Norway. Right, the oil money creates sovereign wealth funds in a massive investment globally, and we have more and more cross-global organization. But we also have long gasoline lines in the US, and we have a sort of crisis of the system that can't move forward. And we have the coup in Chile in 1973 that will bring eventually the death of Allende, the neoliberal experiment in Chile. Now, I said the other crisis that's going on at the same time is a sort of crisis of solidarity. It's a crisis of people who don't, and I could describe that at more details, just not this talk, but it's a crisis of people who don't think the system's working for them the way that it's supposed to work. Social mobility loses its appeal if all you get is being forced to wear a suit and work in an office. There's relative affluence, there's relative abundance, but there we are bombing Vietnam, and there are all things going on. Now, I want to not tell you a story of the 1960s, but tell you a story of what comes out of this, which is liberalism. Two different versions, a kind of expressive romantic version. We should be free from all these social constraints, and a more economic version. We should be free as property owners to invest however we want. And the two link up in a sort of unholy marriage. The romantic expressive individualism helps to inform the projects that will get to be called identity politics, though I'm actually not fond of the term. That is, the projects of providing inclusion that are developed, but inclusion without economic transformation. So the basic issue, it seems to me, is not identity politics. It's not affirmative action. It's not any of the issues with minorities or women or all of the rest of that. It is that this is done without economic transformation. That is pivotal. So you get a liberal elite, which from the 1970s to now is committed to greater inclusion, which is good, but not to greater equality, which is a problem, which tries to understand inclusion in terms of freedom. I meant to include a slide, but I didn't add it, of a tweet by Joe Biden 2 days ago, in which he says simply that his hope for America is for a society in which everybody can advance as far as their God-given talents and hard work take them. In other words, a classic expression of the liberal dream of 50, 60 years ago. That absence of the redistribution of income is pivotal going on. Declining trust in US government, right, dates from the era of the Vietnam War and the era of the civil rights movement in various ways. Complicated story as to why, but note when it begins here. It doesn't begin with neoliberalism. It's causal. It's one of the things that makes this alternative neoliberal story look like a plausible story. Now here's neoliberalism on the stage, remarkably consistent with classical liberalism in many respects, but not all. The grandfatherly guy in the upper right, Friedrich Hayek, as I said, publishes The Road to Serfdom in 1944. It is centrally a work about freedom. We have to take the neoliberals' liberalism seriously. Freedom is Hayek's major goal. He thinks freedom has to be protected by a private property-based enterprise system. And he may be wrong about a variety of conclusions. Polanyi himself grumbled that there were no examples of social democracies becoming totalitarian. There were only examples of hyper-capitalist societies becoming totalitarian. That Hayek's wrong, but his goal in any case is freedom. And with the aid of Milton Friedman and others, the smiling, genial guy, lower left, neoliberalism effectively becomes a dominant ideology for 50 years. Right? And a kind of social movement that changes not just how economists think, but changes a wide part of the ideology of the business community and the understanding of policymakers, and spreads a set of norms, not unlike that in Polanyi's original era. Right? I want to suggest there's a double movement in ideas, right? That in effect, neoliberalism recapitulates capitalist liberalism with added force, because what we have is a reaction, right? We have a sort of old-fashioned Fichtean dialectic, which we have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but we have more and more force in this. So the old liberals felt they had to attack tradition to win a liberal economy. The new liberals feel they have to attack not just tradition, but Keynesianism, welfare states, organized capitalism, and socialism in the world. So they attack with a lot of force. And as in Polanyi's day, ideas matter. This intellectual agenda is driven by serious work and economic analysis. If there were no really good work going on, it wouldn't take root, but it's very ideological. It's centrally about the idea that private property and private interests and individuals are all natural. That's natural to the world. And anything public or social is artificial. Hence Margaret Thatcher's "there's no such thing as society," which is in fact echoing Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, who said there's no such thing as community, right? And there is no alternative because this is all nature. Right? Now, is it laissez-faire? Is it nature? Well, not so much, right? Government action was crucial to neoliberal marketization. This de-governmentalization was done by governments, right? Deregulation, selling state enterprises, expanding property relations, for example, selling off public housing stock, extending credit in a variety of ways. The lower right-hand corner is one of the many housing complexes that were built in the European Union's coastal areas with extremely cheap credit from the European Union before the financial crisis, and then abandoned, or at least temporarily abandoned, during and after the financial crisis, right? State action made this possible. And the state marketizes the use of what had been public facilities, like, say, the University of Wisconsin, and others around the country. So you get this rising chart of the cost of going to university over time. And of course, government debt keeps going up. So we have a neoliberal era. And it's an era that is characterized by radically increased inequality that a lot of people have talked about. We can complain as sociologists that Thomas Piketty gets all the credit, but he's talked about it very well, right? But there's not only a crisis of inequality, there's a crisis of the social that is basic to this era. And deindustrialization is its sort of banner, right? So this is not the only cause of social disruption that's going on, but it is the reminder of the Polanyi point. The disruption matters, and the long run does not excuse it. So the massive deindustrialization from the late 70s on through very recently causes huge upheaval in people's lives and suffering. It's excused by the idea that the GDP keeps growing, and even that in some cases average wage rates keep growing, right? But not for those people. It's linked to financialization. It's a lot easier to move money from Pittsburgh to Shanghai than it is to move an actual factory. And it's coupled with minimal transitional help to workers. This is true across countries and all that. There are countries like Germany that resist the trend, that try to keep their middle-sized industries open, that try to maintain high employment. But in Britain and the United States and Australia and a variety of other places, there's minimal transitional help to workers. Communities are hugely damaged. You can chart this by the increasing average age of people in the deindustrialized communities, because there are no opportunities for young people. And all of this is done in a way that dramatically undercuts unions and thus workers' power, part of the agenda. At the same time, this frustrating idea of meritocracy just goes further and further. Two quick examples. No, I know. Yeah, I gotta stop. The two quick examples are just, think of universities, right, as engines of meritocratic inequality. During this 50-year period, the inequality in higher education increased enormously, however you track it, right? So universities were less equal. getting a college degree meant less, where you went mattered more, and so forth and so on. And we produced a set of elites, like the people running the new tech companies in Silicon Valley, who all think they are obviously the best and the brightest, the smartest boys in the room. They went to Stanford and MIT, and therefore they are entitled to their wealth and to the power that goes with it. Meanwhile, we get some people who are resentful. They're not just waiting around for Arlie Hochschild to study them. Their resentments are growing outside of this particular embassy from Berkeley. Right? Now, quickly, I think you know the figures of the dramatic inequality of income that's going on, so I'm not going to belabor the point. Right? Inequality of wealth is arguably even more important and returns to levels that we hadn't seen since the early part of the 20th century, since the Gilded Age. During the COVID pandemic, that is right now, we see the extent to which assets are appreciating while millions of people are losing their jobs. Right? So the story of wealth is a story of returns to assets. In many ways, assets are being rewarded. Property is being rewarded in this neoliberal era way more than labor. Right? Back to Polanyi and all of this. The response is populism, not class mobilization. People who think they are the people and they're getting screwed as the people revolt, in my view, with a very misguided idea of what will help them, right? But revolt. They revolt in part because I wanted to suggest of this Polanyian story of displacement, the loss of community and place at various scales, local community up to the nation state. It's a story of decline and destruction in which thriving local communities lose their schools, lose their hospitals, right? Get opiate addiction in return. It's a story of geographic mobility, which reduces these ties. You lose your job in one place and you have to go get one somewhere else. And a sense of placelessness. The places stop feeling like places. If I had time, I'd talk about the Midlands of England here and the way in which what was once the center of England feels like it's nowhere in particular. And guess what? The largest employer is Amazon warehouses and cargo-only airports and all of this. This produces this era in which we have a politics of the local versus the metropolitan, in many ways, played out in US elections in terms of less dense and more dense places, but it's really about metropolitan versus local. Nationalist anxieties focused on scapegoating refugees, but in many ways about who are we in this global order, demands for a sense of belonging. They're challenged by many liberal definitions of progress, long-term for that. So I'm truncating. I knew it was going to go too long. I knew I couldn't get through to a more developed conclusion, right? Double movement is a matter of social loss and social reconstruction in this story, not just a matter of economic loss and eventual rise of wages. Polanyi ended his book with a small section, looking forward to a transformation in progress, what he thought would happen after the war. He was pretty accurate. This brought the welfare state and organized capitalism. As I suggested, that turned out to have some basic catches, which made it not an enduring solution. And we get double movements over and over again. Now, at the moment, right, social movements look somewhat less robust than social democratic and labor movements looked at the end of World War II. So we need to ask what's happening on the movement front. Are we going to be able to carry through on the second movement of protecting society? Maybe the Green New Deal is going to be the movement that's crucial. But if so, we need to ask Polanyian questions. Can we make it democratic, not technocratic? Right? Is it really about people's participation from the bottom up? Does it exist at local and state levels, or is it all about federal action because the federal government has the money to invest in it? And is it able to reconstruct society and solidarity and democratic processes, not only take on its two headline objectives of meeting the challenge of climate change and the challenge of jobs? If so, then double movements can continue. If not, then it's worth remembering that Polanyi said, the second movement is not guaranteed. the protection of society is not guaranteed. He said it's action and a reaction, but the reaction can be rising crime rates, it can be war, it can be violent revolution. There's no guarantee it will take the form of building greater social solidarity. Thanks.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Craig. That was really fascinating, and we still have some time for questions just now. So I'm just going to tell you how to do this just now. If you would like to ask a question, there's two different ways you can do it. The first thing is you can raise your hand virtually. So at the bottom of your screen, there should be an option that says participants. If you click on participants, a bar will open on the right-hand side of your screen, and there'll be a button saying raise hand. If you click on that, I'll see that you've raised your hand, and I'll be able to unmute you. And then you can ask your question. If you do that, I'd ask you to switch your video on as well for recording purposes. Oh. If you'd prefer, you can also just send me a direct message in the chat with your question, and I will ask the question on your behalf. Just again, a quick reminder, if you want to raise your hand virtually, click on participants and then click on raise your hand. And I will try to take 3 questions at a time. So please do let me know if you'd like to talk, if you'd like to ask a question. Okay, so I have Richard. Richard, I will unmute you. And if you could switch your video on as well, that'd be great.
See, am I unmuted now?
There you go.
We can see you and hear you, Richard.
Yeah, hi, good to see you.
You too.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, my question focuses on the very end of your talk, where you rightly point out that the double movement back towards some sort of social solidarity isn't guaranteed. And do you think, whether that occurs or not, is a matter of organization among those who, are trying to rebuild social solidarity, or is it something that flows, more or less out of the way in which capitalism or markets are organized, or the sorts of state structures and what sorts of opportunities those create?
So, you know how I'm going to answer, Richard, because I've been writing about social movement. It's my whole life. Nothing's automatic. So the stage is certainly set by transformations in other dimensions of capitalism. But I think the chance of getting a positive reconstruction is almost entirely a matter of organization, political as well as economic organization. That is, in the previous case, it was trade unions as well as democratic politics. And there were often sort of pointless debates about which was it really. It clearly took both. And I think that's likely now. So we have very weak labor and big questions about how we can get stronger labor organization. And we have very problematic democratic politics. So if we want to see that reconstruction, we need organization. I mean, this has to be brought about. We didn't get the post-war boom and les Trente Glorieuses and organized capitalism simply by some natural process of change. We got it by labor power, which was able to introduce demands. And we got it by having democratic elected societies in which, for all of their faults, it was possible to translate popular wishes into policy to some extent.
And do you think democracy has been so degraded in the US and much of Europe that it'll be much harder to reconstitute that now?
Much harder.
Yeah.
Yes, so this is based on a sort of third chapter of a book called Degenerations of Democracy, which is mostly concerned with the economic and with the political problems and the social underpinnings, but also to some extent the economic. And our account is one in which we have seen democracy degenerate pretty much to the breaking point, not necessarily to break, but to break if we don't act dramatically. And of course, the sad truth is what you just said, that at the very moment when we need this strong action, we seem to be lacking in organized capacity for it. So, socialism or barbarism.
Thanks very much to both of you. I have a couple of people indicated to ask questions, and I've also had a couple of questions in the chat. So I'll take 3 just now. So I will start with a question from Samina. And she says, would you have a sense of what the criteria is to know if the reaction is towards redistribution or not? What if something seemingly terrible is a step towards redistribution? And what if something seemingly terrific is teetering society towards further inequity? So that's the first question. I have another question from Michael Goodman. And he asks, did company towns like Pullman, Illinois, East St. Louis, Missouri, Kohler, Wisconsin, and so on, play any significant role in the transitions which you have looked at in your presentation? So that's 2 questions in the chat. And I also have Kermit Hovey, who's asked a question. So I'll just ask you to unmute now. And if you could go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thanks. I found your presentation mind-bogglingly stimulating and intriguing. And one of the grids I'm coming at this material with is addressing the climate crisis and trying to, as an activist and advocate, gain insight into the magnitude of the problem and how to approach it. And I don't know that I have had time since all that you've said to crystallize a question, but there are some that are pursuing a market-based solution, trying to find ways to put signals into the marketplace and let the magic of the market help drive the shift in our society and economy regarding fossil fuel use and things. And there's a way in which I'm hearing you say the market is painfully problematic, and I've heard that from others. And so is there any hope? And if so, what thoughts might you offer?
Thanks very much, Kermit. Craig, just before I bring you back in, we usually go until 1:30 in these sessions, and we're running out of time now. I'm just wanting to ask, would you be okay extending for another 15 minutes or so you can answer those questions and see how far we get?
I'm okay. It's no doubt my fault that we're running over. So there you are.
Not at all. I think everyone was really enjoying the presentation, so you were very welcome to run over, but it's great if you can spend a little bit more time here again to everyone.
I am happy. I can stay on, and I'm happy to do so. So let me try to respond to each of the 3 questions serially and briefly. First, how do we know whether we're getting redistribution? How do we know whether we're getting the good or the bad out of things? I don't have an easy mechanism that says that, because we often get both at once. And I think that the question reveals basically a good point, which is if you try to evaluate things on one single set of criteria, you got trouble. We've got to look at the interaction imbalances. So we have policies that are good on certain dimensions and problematic on others. So in the kind of famous recognition versus redistribution arguments of Nancy Fraser and Axel Honneth and others, the answer is always both and. It's not either or. And the only thing that I want to bring to this is the emphasis on solidarity, which I take to be at least evoked, if not defined, by saying making connections. I think that it's not just distributions of wealth or income, and it's not just formal actions of recognition. It is connections that matters. So building social cohesion and connections. The question about company towns is absolutely on target. And yes, company towns are an example of what I meant by capitalist re-embedding, dominated by the capitalist system, but producing a kind of embeddedness that goes on. And they vary a great deal from pretty impoverished and racially divided North Carolina mill towns through Pullman, Illinois, and others. And yet, pretty widely, they are experienced by people as securing their place in the world. So that doesn't mean that kids always want to stay there and not go away to college or whatever. But it does mean that they are producing a level of security. So like the framework knitters, who for a time had a level of security, not great wealth, they're, you know, they are providing this within the capitalist framework. And linking that to the first question, you know, what we want to ask is, are the extent to which they are dominated directly by capitalism or by capitalists, and the extent to which they are exploited and not very well off, enough to sacrifice the social embeddedness and stability they bring? And the answer, I'd say, for most cases is yes, but not always, because it depends on what you're getting instead. When you leave and exit from one of these towns, are you exiting because you got a scholarship to the University of Wisconsin, or are you exiting to seek an uneven future in the auto industry shortly before it crashes? I grew up in Kentucky. Lots of my high school classmates headed north to the auto industry. Most of them in time to benefit considerably from that, but if you will, our younger brothers and sisters, mostly it was brothers, no, in time to experience the crash of the auto industry. So it wasn't, you know, such a clear improvement. And all of these options are different from improvement in place, right? Should you get out of your company town is one question. Could you organize a labor movement that would change your company town is a different question. And for 50 years, we haven't asked the second question often enough. I mean, there are community organizers, there are people trying to do this. I don't mean to belittle that, but the dominant trend has been not to look at how to rescue and transform local place, but how to get out if it wasn't working for you. The last question about climate, I'm as much at a loss as Kevin, but I also think it's one of the most important questions on the agenda. And so quickly, markets are not enough. We just this week had another series of accounts. Oh, good, post-COVID, it's going to be possible to have effective market action. Look, China's going to try and Biden's going to cry and all will be fine. There's no conceivable market solution, it seems to me. That doesn't mean that it's not good to try market measures to the extent possible, but there's no conceivable market solution. There's not even a conceivable market mitigation, right? So not only can this not prevent climate change, it's already happening. Markets are going to play a role, but not be the satisfactory thing. And this goes back to Polanyi saying, it's if you think markets are everything and they dominate that you have a problem. It's not the existence of markets, it's letting market thinking dominate and crowd out everything else that is such a disaster. And in the climate change case, anything that promises a really full and effective coping strategy for humanity with climate change involves extremely deep social transformation. And so we at least have to have on the table, how's that going to get guided? And that's where I think the question of movements and the question of social awareness and consciousness come into this, that with very minimal movement and organization, things will happen to us. We won't be able to guide them.
Thanks very much, Craig. So I have three questions now. Okay, fantastic. So first, I'm going to ask a question from the chat, and then I will take Joel and Chad in turn. So the first question is from Michelle, and she says, let's talk more about collective power and describing it. There needs to be a code switch because socialism, even Christian socialism, is demonized. Could we use organized capitalism instead? So that's the first question. And the next question is from Joel Rogers.
Can you hear me now? Craig, I'm looking for the pony in here somewhere, as Ronald Reagan used to joke. And you said, well, it's in response to Richard's question, well, it's basically socialism or barbarism. I'm much more optimistic about prospects, in part because along with the different ungodly trends or ungoodness trends in neoliberalism that you've seen over the last 50 years, you've also seen a fantastic increase in urbanization around the world and even in the US. And I think that's shifting the material basis of power, which will eventually show up somewhere in our politics, or could show up in our politics through a reinvention of federalism in a more democratic way, in which you got enough political power nationally to set floors on local innovation, and you could support that local innovation through credit assistance, deregulatory stuff, et cetera. The basis of that would be the metropolitan areas, which by definition give you the connectedness that you, I think, rightly see as the real basis of any solidarity. I invite any comment you have on that.
Thanks very much, Joel. And we have Chad to ask the last one of this group of questions. Chad, if you could switch your video on as well, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, okay, good. I think everything's working now, video and audio. Yeah, so I actually, so if Joel ended on a note of optimism, I'm maybe going to end on a note of pessimism. I think, Craig, your talk already ended on a bit of a pessimistic note, because you emphasized that the second movement is never guaranteed, and Joel was expressing some hope why in this case we might see a second movement. But I think maybe even more pessimism is warranted. I hate to say it, but I'm somebody who worries a lot. And the reason I think so is that in your talk, you sort of passed over Polanyi's discussion of fascism. And that's because you didn't have time to really get into the world wars. You mentioned them, you alluded to them, but didn't really talk about fascism. And my reading of Polanyi is that fascism is also a movement of self-protection. It's not a good one, but it's a movement of self-protection. It's a movement of rebuilding solidarity and rebuilding community, not for people with my last name, but for a lot of other people. It was, and it was something that people embraced for that reason. Sherry Berman has made this argument, and so it seems to me that there are three possibilities here. One is that we don't see the development of an effective movement back to solidarity. The second possibility is that we do, and it's some kind of new version or analog to social democracy. And the third is that we see a movement back to solidarity, which is actually worse than neoliberalism, which is a kind of analog to fascism in the 20th century. And not a question, but I would be interested to hear your response to that.
Thanks very much. Those are three big questions, so I'll hand that back over to you.
Yeah, really good questions. I'm going to sort of combine my answer to all three. I really want to say something like, I'm more optimistic. And I, quote the Gramsci line or something else. And I do think that there are lots of potential paths. I don't think urbanization by itself produces this. Planetary urbanization changes the playing field. It's a major thing going on. It could be the basis for a decentralized new federalism. It could be the basis for a renewal of place-based conditions, but this doesn't seem to me guaranteed just in the fact of urbanization. That said, I think the question points to part of the path, which is decentralization and federalism. So I think that the extremely large scale at which we have come to organize both markets and democratic states, and the extremely centralized pattern of that is part of the problem. And if we're to have solutions to climate change, if we're to have more empowerment of citizens, it has to come more through relatively direct relationships of those citizens to each other. And so, the local and the decentral, including the urban in this sense, matters. By the time you're talking of cities of many millions, the pattern of connection or non-connection within them is just about as problematic as it is at the level of nation states. And one of the pandemic lessons, it's always seemed to me, as we start out talking about social distancing, and then people said, oh no, we should just talk about physical distancing. We forget how socially distant we were even without a pandemic lockdown. And occasionally the pandemic brings to our awareness things like, oh, those people who are delivering food to our doors, we middle-class people, are different in some sense. They're suffering, whereas we're just, at home, they're exposed and we're relatively protected. And gee, there are people of color and immigrants and women. And long story short here, I think as important as urbanization is the transformation of employment structures into what is called a service sector, which is just enormous. That's too undifferentiated a term. And we haven't worked that through. The loss of unionization that went with that. Well, what are the strategies for changing that? The demographic shift, the fact that this is largely women, people of color, immigrants in these service and especially care jobs. Now, being able to articulate this suggests paths for building a better solidarity. It doesn't suggest the movement strength to do it. I think that, I come back to how do we get going down that path? But that seems to me important to the path, and it's related to what you say about cities, right? So that seems to be the right direction. I'm just not as optimistic that we're going to get there, but I want to be optimistic. Chad is absolutely right that fascism is on Polanyi's list, and it should have been on my list of bad things that can happen. The ways in which there are two levels of this. There's a destruction, and then there can be chaos in a sense, lots of continued destruction, barbarism, as I alluded to the force term. Two, there can be bad solidarities, and fascism is the preeminent example in Polanyi's mind of a bad solidarity. But I think we need to note this today when we talk about, oh, we need more social solidarity. Well, we need good social solidarity. Having solidarity is no substitute for having some sense of the public good and some relatively inclusive politics. I need to balance that. I probably come down closest to Chad of the questioners here. In relation to Michelle's original question, though, I'm inclined, and my co-authors and I have settled on using the term social democracy. I'm not sure socialism is as completely demonized and tainted. I've been struck throughout the repeated Bernie Sanders candidacies by the extent to which many voters simply don't care about the debates of 75 years ago, and the McCarthy era, the Red Scare, and all this sort of thing. Nonetheless, it's still tainted. I'm as troubled by the extent to which many of socialists, I think Richard and I are both members of the Democratic Socialists of America, probably others are, but the DSA, which I was around for the founding of, leaves me feeling that, uncommon with many articles in Jacobin magazine and others parts of socialism, the issue is not just being demonized, the issue is the longstanding left tendency towards factionalism and perfectionism, and trying to get perfect solutions instead of improvements. So I'm worried that there isn't the strength in that, under that banner, that I would like to see. And so I settle on social democracy without any great enthusiasm for the label, since I grew up among people who called the Social Democrats USA SEDUSA in order to signal the problems with that approach. But what it does signal, and this goes back to each of the other questions, is that democracy is part of the issue. If we can't save democracy, then many of the other things are off the table. And so we need to save democracy first. We do that partly by building solidarity, but then in addition to saving democracy, we need to build movements to deal with climate change, to deal with other issues, and that strengthens solidarity. And we need to do this in a way that is not all centralized. It can't be all decentralized, if you will, or it doesn't deal with modern states and corporations, but it needs to be at least significantly recovering the diversity of polities within polities, which I think Joel was suggesting with his mention of federalism.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And you have kept perfectly to time for that extra 15 minutes as well. So I would like to thank you and to thank everyone else. Usually there'll be some applause at this point. Unfortunately, we can only do this with our reactions in the screen, but thank you so much. That was wonderful. So as I said at the start, this is the last Havens Right Centre talk of the semester. All of the talks have been recorded and you can now get them on our website from the start of next week. Sorry that they have taken a little bit of while in uploading. We've had some technical difficulties due to being off campus, as I'm sure everyone has experienced so far. But I posted a link already, which you can see in the chat, which will